Hey guys, this is the seventh installment of our discussion on Augustine's On Free Choice of the Will. We're going to have to really summon up some crazy energy to get through all of this today.
Yup.
I think both Jordan and I were pretty restless last night, anticipating the results of Super Tuesday. So we may be low energy, but let's see if we come alive here in the discussion of Book 2, chapters 8 through 12?
Yes.
Okay. So the habit that I've gotten into is that I go back and I listen to our podcast now. And typically I find things that are really ticky-tacky that I like to improve upon, like where we went wrong, what we didn't do a good enough job of or whatever.
Right.
I have to say, we kind of kicked ass last podcast.
Yes. I need to hear that today.
I really couldn't crucify us too hard. I thought we did a pretty decent job, so I won't get hung up on that too much. So I want to recapitulate just a little bit of the conversation we were trying to have towards the end of the last podcast. Maybe I should defer to you here. What did we concern ourselves with at the end of last podcast?
Oh my gosh, pretty much like the ranking of. Oh my gosh. Sorry. It's one of those days.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Go with it.
Just gonna
embrace it. Go for it.
Yep, just gonna embrace that. The subjugating inferior things to superior things.
We got that. That was good.
Got that. And you gotta help me out on this one.
All right. So ultimately, what we're trying to do by subjugating the different perceptive faculties, the inner sense, reason, and trying to find
the working relationship between all of them.
Right. We were trying to find something that was above reason, and the whole purpose of this is that Augustine is trying to prove God, right? And he's
laying it out in like a lot of complicated stages.
Right. And we got to the point where he had to try to find something that was eternal and immutable and above fallible human reason. And we talked about number being that thing.
Right.
We talked about number, mathematics, essentially as being timeless a priori truths that will endure regardless of the person who is doing the math or not, that can be checked against our fallible reason. But then he makes this curious move that we kind of started to explore, but we didn't really get too far into it, by analogizing wisdom with mathematical truth. And I think he listed off there being three essential characteristics of wisdom: that of the wise seek the good, seek happiness, and avoid evil. And that these are all sort of interwoven. And really, I think something that came out in my coverage this week of the Augustine is not to really think of those as separable traits, but all sort of interpenetrating traits that make up the form of wisdom. Right. So wisdom, wherever it is going to seek the good, seek happiness, and avoid evil. And we talked about the sun analogy. Can you bring that into how this plays with the idea of there being a universal form of wisdom?
Yeah, sure. So, Augustine basically says that, because he asks the question whether or not, sort of like how he asks Evodius with number, is wisdom something that is singular and universal, or relative and manifest in many forms? Right. So the analogy that he
and Evodius thinks that it's relative.
Right.
And why does Evodius think that it's relative?
And because he says, something along the lines of, people who are farmers think they're wise because, they take care of the earth, they feed themselves, families, their communities. Soldiers, think that they are wise because they are, defending their homelands. And, we have, politicians who are taking care of, earthly affairs and just things that other people, like soldiers and farmers, don't want to deal with. And then, wise people who consider themselves the wisest are people that, meet their earthly obligations to an extent, but then have time to contemplate, wisdom. And then there are people who contemplate wisdom entirely, and they are considered the wisest. But everyone has their own perception of wisdom. Right.
So the point that Evodius is trying to make is that wisdom can't be singular if everybody's using it in a different way. But Augustine answers with the sun metaphor,
right,
by saying, that wisdom is the same for everybody. It's trained and applied to different things.
It's the same source, but what it casts light on and sort of illuminates is different for everyone. So the projection of wisdom may seem different to everyone, but ultimately it's the highest and the greatest truth and the greatest good. It's still universal and it still applies to everyone.
Yes. So, and I think Evodius and Augustine and ourselves and our listeners and everything like that are going to be like, that's a really wonderful sentiment. What the hell do you mean by wisdom? What is it? You know? And what I thought was really great about this chapter is that, or these chapters, is that Augustine is going to try to lay out eternal truths of wisdom, eternal precepts of wisdom that are just as indubitable and universal as 2 + 2 = 4.
Right.
And he's going to say that each of these precepts of wisdom are going to correspond to a virtue of the goodwill. And I think we should try to figure that out perhaps as we go. Mm-hmm. So
because one of the questions he asks is, how is like wisdom visible and manifest? And then he points to these, were they the lights of virtue, right?
Yeah. Right. So these precepts, he calls them the lights of the virtue, right? So I think it'd be pretty cool for us to go through them. What he thinks. So my understanding is that he thinks these are the exact same as like times tables.
Right.
That like
right.
Each one of these will be the same regardless of culture or where we are in time.
Right. It's like a standard like measure, pretty much.
Right. And there are 7 of them.
Right.
Right. And wise people across the board follow these 7 precepts. And they then bestow the virtues of character that we get from the participation and reason,
right? Which
will lead to questions I have later towards the podcast. Mm-hmm. But maybe did you enumerate them? Because I wrote them all out.
I have some of them, but
all right. I just wrote all 7.
Okay.
And so the first one is that wisdom ought to be rigorously sought.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. So, what do we say about that? So this is supposed to be. That's supposed to have the same. That is supposed to have the same status as 2 + 2 = 4. That the wisdom ought to be rigorously sought. Like wherever you go, everybody's going to be like, "Yes, that's true."
Right.
Does that have the same in your mind? Does that have the same status as 2 + 2 = 4? Wisdom ought to be sought.
Because I feel like if you just like walked up to someone on the street, right, and you'd say, "Hey, would you prefer to wallow in ignorance?" And I think people would inherently say, "No." So I mean, like that's. I feel like if you like teased it out in your mind, you could get to that point. But I think, 2 × 2 = 4, and everyone should seek wisdom. What?
Are those?
How do you equate those two?
I mean, I guess the thing is that 2 + 2 = 4 is self-evident. Is it self-evident that everyone ought to seek wisdom? Would anyone deny that wisdom was something that they ought to orient their lives around? Does everybody intrinsically want to be wise?
And I think that we need to look at the relationship between wisdom and happiness, because they're both interconnected, if not entirely the same. So everyone, I think that if we posit the question, if everyone wants to be happy, then we can also say, does everyone want to be wise? And I think the answer for those, according to Augustine, is yes.
Well, everyone definitely wants to be happy, right? Like, I think that's just kind of like
Nicomachean Ethics, right, with Aristotle?
Well, yeah.
Kind of touched on it
the thing is the conception of happiness, right? And the thing is that everyone would confess that they want to be happy, and that because happiness and wisdom are inextricably linked for Augustine.
Right.
Even if someone doesn't acknowledge that wisdom is the sort of modus operandi of their being or whatever, happiness definitely is. They just don't. They perhaps don't know it yet that wisdom is the thing that they're ultimately striving for. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could say that, and you could just be like, look, well, if you're ultimately searching for happiness, like you're going to want to wisdom by extension. But you'd probably have to connect some dots.
Or like even like maybe wisdom is like the end product of happiness, right?
I think they're bound up together. I think that
they're not mutually exclusive.
Right. If you truly want to be happy, I mean, and we've seen this in our discussion of Augustine so far, is that real felicitous sort of happiness that doesn't culminate in some sort of existential despair or whatever is ultimately going to be the result of the cultivation of virtue.
Right.
So let's just say everybody, I don't know if I would find, I mean, could we really do a survey and find somebody who wasn't interested in being wise? Do you think
we could do a straw poll?
Do you think anybody would be like, no, I'm really down with willful ignorance? Do you think anyone would say that?
Yeah, I don't know.
You think they would?
I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to like, do like almost.
No,
like
I'm really into being
people.
dumb. I'm really into being dumb. Like, who would say that? Maybe they don't care. I could see.
Yeah, I could see maybe some people like wouldn't emphasize finding wisdom as a priority.
But then you just have to say you want to be happy, so you want to be wise.
Right.
We're dwelling on it probably a little too long
Right,
because we're at the 10-minute mark. But I think it'd be interesting and I haven't done this philosophical arithmetic in advance, is that if wisdom is something that is rigorously sought, what virtues of the will would it correspond to? I mean, I think if you're rigorously pursuing wisdom, I mean, is there a virtue, justice, fortitude, prudence, temperance that it wouldn't correspond to? Does it favor one more than the other? Because, I mean, if you're pursuing wisdom, like, I mean, could you be, I mean, you're practicing justice in some sense, right?
Right,
like,
yeah, exactly. Because you're giving yourself and everyone else, like, what's owed. Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like that they're all, like, interconnected. It's not like one gives priority to another.
Well, there were some that there were two, specifically the third and the seventh, that he particularly allocated to certain virtues, and maybe we'll make it easier when we get to those.
Right.
Let's move on to the second one and see if it's as indubitable as everyone pursuing wisdom rigorously. Essentially, the just life should be lived. Is that as indubitable as 2 + 2 = 4?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the question of like kind of like what we talked about, like relative wisdom. Well, I think that people could say that there's like a relative justice and say, yeah, I live a pretty just life.
I don't know. I feel like there are a lot of people that when they think about constituting their lives, they're not so much interested in doing things like living a just life as that being the first and foremost thing. I think there's a lot of people that would. So maybe we could make the case that someone is like pursuing a type of wisdom if they're pursuing their happiness. I think that would be sort of indubitable.
Right.
But if they're pursuing the just life, I don't know if everybody's going to fess up to that. Like, there are going to be people who are like, look, I'm out for power. Look, I'm out for pleasure.
Right.
I'm not really so much concerned with the just life. Like, you can live for social justice and things like that, but I'm really just out for myself. I'm really not so sure that one's as obvious as the pursuit of wisdom. Or is it? I don't know.
Yeah, I think I always get hung up with justice, always.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things, yeah, it's not particularly like that evident, you know what I mean? It's not like thrown in our faces.
Yeah.
So I'm not really quite sure about that one.
I mean, I think we have to have a better understanding of what justice is.
Right.
I mean, I think that might be part of the reason why we're getting hung up on this, is because we don't have an accurate rendering of what precisely we mean.
Right, because we get the definition of wisdom here, but we don't really necessarily get that as like concrete or like drawn out or explicit definition of justice.
We did mess around with justice earlier. I wonder if that could inform what we're doing at all. I mean, justice earlier, right, was about ordering ourselves in accordance with divine law, right? Was having reason participate in the divine law by bringing the will in accordance with it, right? So like we should. So
I guess that's one of those like virtues, you know what I mean? If like being a virtuous person, which includes justice, you know, yields wisdom, or like which like cultivates happiness. It's like a very circular.
I think we'd have to
process.
play on we'd have to play on people's pursuit of happiness and be like, look, you say you want happiness, when you say you want happiness, even though you're going towards power or pleasure or whatever else, you really want wisdom and justice. That happiness is trying to direct you towards
right,
wisdom.
It's like a trajectory.
Yeah,
right.
You just kind of suck at being happy. Like the organism that is you is craving happiness, but you're looking for it in all the wrong places. What's the country song? You're looking for love in all the wrong places.
Right.
Like you're looking for it in all the wrong places. You really crave. If you really sought wisdom and justice, you would have that happiness sated. Mm-hmm. So maybe they're the same thing. All right, let's move on to the third one.
Okay.
Superior things ought to subject inferior things. Now he says that definitely plays into the virtue of the goodwill named justice.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Is that indubitable? Superior things ought to subject inferior things. I think generally, you could get really ticky-tacky with this because it's like, how do you define what is superior and what is inferior, right? Like we've used this whole principle of judging superior and inferior and trying to prove God. Like we said that the inner sense judges the individual senses or whatever, therefore the inner sense is superior to those individual senses, right. And we've said reason judges the inner sense, therefore.
Exactly the same.
Are they really intrinsically superior, or is that the human projection? Mm-hmm. The thing I worry about that being a human projection is that someone could play fast and loose, and you can speak to the historical context of this, is that this principle right here, I get worried about how that could be applied to people.
Right, and then, not to mention, too, if it's our own projection, Augustine even says in the text that our minds are subject to change, they're changeable, they're not perfect, they stray in error from, the path of truth. So that's kind of, my problem with it is if it's, if this sort of, ranking is something we're doing in our own minds, then it's subject to error.
It's
not...
Well, it seems kind of interesting if reason is fallible, you have to question whether or not this is totally indubitable. So I don't know.
So that makes me wonder: is it just is it a limitation of human reasoning? You know what I mean? Because I think God's reasoning and God's judgment is perfect and absolute, but we're human. We have our limitations. Yeah. So that's kind of what I'm kind of yee.
The thing that worries me about this precept of wisdom is that it may be working off the time period in the sense that it may be very okay with monarchical stratification or church stratification.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And this may be something that people could borrow from to subjugate slaves and things like that. So that's
I think that's one of the reasons why
I'm wondering what's animating.
Yeah, that's why Christianity really solidified, because it basically incorporated civic modes of religion, but also political.
Yeah.
And that's why emperors eventually were like, "Hey, this is actually pretty good stuff here.
Yeah,
we can get on board with this.
Yeah,
hold on.
This stratification thing actually serves our political ends
like
pretty
this.
Well. Yeah. We'll embrace that. All right. So the fourth precept, or the simple truth of wisdom that is supposed to be eternal and you can't not falsifiable, is, or maybe not falsifiable is not the word or the expression, but not indubitable. Again, is that we ought to compare like to like.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? That one seems stronger in a way, right? This is how we do science, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or kind of ratios and stuff like that. It definitely. This seems like the most mundane one, but this seems like the most concrete one in my mind.
Yeah, I can get on board with that. That one's pretty obvious.
Right.
I'm not gonna nitpick too much about it, but when we compare like to like, again, is that sort of just kind of how we schematize and do sort of the rational ordering of the world? Is that human projection, or is that really an eternal principle?
Right.
So maybe some of these questions will get answered. What about, is there a virtue that would necessarily associate with? I mean, I think it would go with justice, right?
Yeah,
like compared to
I
like
think
to like, like I mean, just think about like case precedent or something like that, right? Like, what if you're going to practice justice, you're going if you have a verdict in one scenario, it should apply to the exact same scenario.
Right,
Equal
exactly.
treatment
Like rulings.
Yeah, you
similar
should have
rulings.
I'm sure you could, depending on certain construals of fortitude and prudence and temperance, you could employ it as well. But I think it most obviously goes with justice. What's the next one here? Okay, each should be given their due. So that's going to be obviously
the elusive definition of justice.
Yeah, so that's going to be justice again.
And corruption is greater than corruption.
Yeah, like that. Well, I have that as number 7 or.
Oh, sorry.
I have that as 7. I actually have 8 of these things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but each should be given their due. And like I said, a lot of these could probably be conflated, but I'm just bringing them out because that's what the details said. I mean, that's justice. I don't know. Is that obvious? Is that an obvious definition of justice? Because there are a lot of people that conceive that wouldn't be an appropriate discussion of justice. That a lot of people would want to not. I guess I would say the content that they would put into this would be different. So, like the due, like if you think about in terms of like a political structuring or whatever, what a conservative views as someone getting their due versus what a liberal may view as what someone gets as their due. They both may subscribe to this principle, but the content they input to it could be totally different. Whereas like with a mathematical principle, like let's say you're a liberal and I'm a conservative or whatever, like your 2 is going to be the same as my 2, but the due is going to be different if we have different ideological structures in place.
Right. Maybe, I mean, I can't help but wonder, I don't know. Was I say maybe like there was like more consensus or sort of like to the audience to whom Augustine was writing for? I mean, because that's the thing, I think that everything, especially now, is like so individualized that, yeah, it definitely complicates this definition of justice for sure.
Yeah. All right, 6.
Yep.
Eternal is better than temporal.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Now this one I can definitely see matching up with fortitude, prudence, and temperance, right? Because the temporal would be sort of like what speaks to like our appetites and immediacy and things like that. And I could see if we believed in the virtue or we believed in the precept of eternal is better than temporal, then those virtues would obviously get cultivated, and you can easily see how it would cultivate the virtue of justice as well, because it gives justice an anchoring or whatever. It doesn't allow justice to be sort of contextualized by temporal
and it
factors
kind of just anchors it in the eternal.
But is that obvious? Is the eternal better than the temporal? Again, I ask that.
It depends on who you talk to. Well, it depends on the day.
It depends on the conception of the eternal, right?
Right.
Like, if that eternal has the ability to damn you.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's like pretty obvious that the eternal is better than the temporal. But if the eternal is like a vague rational law or like a clock,
something abstract,
something like that, like why would you choose the eternal every time over the temporal? Like maybe there are some instances where the temporal would be superior to the eternal. Yeah. So these things are I'm having problems with Augustine on this because it's not the same as math. They're going to be, there's like, I have to tell more of a story.
I would say it's cool that he's trying to apply this like sort of in a systematic or a mathematical system. It's not quite clicking with me, but I think that the attempt is like cool.
It's a noble effort.
Yeah.
I mean, and we could be totally wrong. I mean, it's the first time I've ever talked about this with somebody, so who knows? I'm going through this for the first time. All right, 7. Uncorrupted is better than the corrupted. I guess we'd rather have something that works than something that's broken.
Yeah, or like, I don't know, I'm thinking like food. Like you don't want like moldy food.
You don't want spoiled food. You don't.
Yeah, like that's gross. hard pass.
Yeah, I mean, and that one might be a little bit more obvious, right?
Yeah.
We say that of these 8, and I realize there are 8 of them rather than 7. Of these 8, I think you and I sort of thought that. What was the other one that we thought was more obvious? Compare like to like. Compare like to like. We thought that was less objectionable. Would you put this one in the same category?
Yeah.
What's interesting here is that we may be coming somewhere out in the middle rather than saying that he has proven certain precepts of wisdom. We may be saying some of these are more universal than others, which is good philosophical work, I think, to go through and do that. I mean, these are interesting insights. But I find that uncorrupted is better than the corrupted. Mm-hmm. Is that more legitimate to you? You agree?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I mean, what about as far as how it corresponds to certain virtues of the goodwill? I mean, fortitude.
Yeah, that's my first thought was fortitude.
Yeah, you'd rather not be corrupted from a perspective of fortitude. Same thing with prudence and temperance.
Yeah.
If you're going to give yourself over for corruption. So you can see how it would play into those virtues.
Right.
Okay, and the last one, the invulnerable is better than the vulnerable. Huh.
I feel like that would just be obvious, but then, yeah, I don't know. I'm a little uneasy about the application of that. I mean, in terms of like
into what objects, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I don't know. I'm thinking like a fortress or something. Like, yeah, you want fortification, like
right? Yeah, when we're talking about fortresses,
you
want an invulnerable fortress. Right. You don't want a vulnerable fortress.
Right. I don't want a weak spot in my wall.
But do you want an invulnerable person? Do you want or is like, or even if that, like, what if we talked about like matter, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Certain elements are going, whatever invulnerable means, like there are going to be certain elements that are going to be invulnerable compared to other elements, right? Mm-hmm. Like, okay, so what does that mean? Like maybe a certain element is more static than another one that's like highly erratic. Right. Mm-hmm. But does that mean that highly erratic element is somehow worse than the static element?
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of am thinking of it in terms of kind of like with like stoicism and like this idea that, you know, thinking it from like that lens, it's better to be invulnerable, and like this idea that you use philosophy to basically like polish you so that you are so smooth that like misfortune cannot like latch onto you and affect you in any way. So kind of thinking about that in that regard, I could see that, but that's one that I can't really quite tease out, you know?
Yeah, and I kind of think about it from a moral perspective too. If we're totally invulnerable and like we won't listen to other points of view or be compassionate, like, because if we are so stoic and we're like, we are right, like we know, or like, like, do we really want to say that they're vulnerable? Like,
right, in terms of like, I don't know, like, yeah, like emotional vulnerability.
I feel like I can pick at this one too.
Yeah.
So of these 8, I feel like we only have 2
that are like
really good.
Are excited about.
Yeah,
like really
we
excited
about.
Like
I'd go to bat for that as like an eternal precept of wisdom.
Right.
Okay. So I don't know how exciting that was, but presumably all of these rules are going to be the eternal truths of wisdom that are going to be the same for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. So what's interesting about this is that it seems like, let's just say for the sake of argument that that these are all irrefutably true and universal. I have a couple questions about that. So the first thing, and I have not thought this out at all, is I'm trying to understand what's the difference between wisdom and reason. Okay? Mm-hmm. You had no idea I was going to ask you this question. So, what do you? Wisdom is he's going to try to say that wisdom is God or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Or it's equal to number. It's eternal, immutable.
Right.
So wisdom can't be reason because why can't it be reason? Why can't it be reason? Why is wisdom not reason?
Well, I mean, like, reason's kind of like the conduit, right? It's not. It's like the means to the end. So
it's like a tool, right?
Right, exactly. So it's like you can use the process of reasoning to obtain wisdom, but like
I think that's
reason can't be the end itself. Like you can't.
And we said you're doing a good job
articulating.
You're doing a good job because last time we said reason was subject to change and was fallible. Right,
exactly.
Right?
So just like our minds, since we apply reason in our minds, we can't. Wisdom is complete and it's perfect, so we can't use a flawed, something that's first thing's flawed, and then a means, and then apply that to a perfect end.
So the precepts, right? So the precepts of wisdom are going to be eternal and immutable, and judging by our own stepladder, right? They're going to be judging our reason, right?
Precisely.
Okay, so that's why wisdom is going to be different from reason. But the thing that I'm trying to understand here is that by reason's participation in these truths of wisdom or whatever, would we say that we become partially wise, or do you become wholly wise? Are there increments of wisdom? Presumably, our wisdom grows, right, as we exercise the rational faculty more and sort of gravitate more towards these wise precepts and become closer to that. I guess the question is like, how are we to think about wisdom in us? Like, what kind of quality is it? Like, if reason is not wisdom, what is wisdom in us? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Do you understand the question I'm asking? So first of all, let's ask the question, can you be partially wise? Can you be incomplete in your wisdom? Ooh. Does your wisdom grow?
Because I want to say that it's, I'm really tempted to say that it's a process and it's something that, you accumulate and you build over time.
Do you think we
But then that doesn't necessarily coincide with Augustine's definition of wisdom.
Well, what do you think it is? How do you understand it? Here's what I know about wisdom right now. It's composed of 8 precepts. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's supposedly superior to reason because it judges reason when it's in error. Right. Our reason's participation in the precepts of wisdom create the virtues. Right? The precepts of wisdom are the lights of the virtues. These are the things I know. And I guess, is he going to say that wisdom is God?
I think he's going to.
Is he going to make that move? I didn't get that far in my preparation today.
Yeah,
but,
me either.
But
it seems like he's leaning, kind of inching us toward that.
It seems like that's where he's going because he's found something that is going to be greater than the human mind. And unless there's something that's greater than wisdom, God is going to have to be wisdom.
Right.
So my question then becomes, right, and we'll have to wait till next episode to get a clearer grasp on whether or not is God wisdom. But let's just say God is wisdom for the sake of argument. What does it mean when we say a person is wise?
Right, because then you can't. Because then does that mean you put yourself in a very impious situation when you say they're wise? Because then do you just automatically equate them with being God? You know what I mean? Or participating in God somehow?
Is God acting through the person? Are we when we're wise? Right, and this is a really fascinating idea. That's not just confined to Augustine, right? When you talk about Hegelian unfolding of the dialectic or whatever, you're talking when so far as people are participating in the absolute or the rational idea or whatever, you're talking about the consciousness that's driving all human activity, comprehending itself in the human being or whatever. So it really isn't that strange of an idea to think about us participating in God or God participating in us in some way if we are wise. I guess the thing that I'm kind of trying to understand here is is wisdom a capacity or an attribute that we possess either wholly or partially? Can I grow in my...
Right.
Do you,
right, yeah.
So
exactly,
let's say that wisdom is God within me, right? So when I'm being wise, like God is coming through me somehow or whatever, right? And like God is shaping.
Channeling God.
Yeah, I am channeling God. He is shaping my character. He is making me more virtuous. He's bestowing virtuous felicity upon me, right? Okay, but can I not grow in my wisdom? Can I not become more wise? I mean, supposedly wisdom is, if it's God, it's going to be infinite, right? Like and my finite frame can only contain so much of it, and as I grow older, I can presumably become better at wisdom or internalize it more.
Right, and I mean, and you hear people's experiences saying that they've had, like they are becoming or they have been closer to God. So in my mind, it seems like it's an ongoing process. It doesn't seem like like a one-time transformation or, yeah.
Well, the interesting thing here is like, if, and we're doing a lot of speculating right now.
Right.
Like, so we might have to, I'm going to have to listen to this and prep for next week and revise it all. And, I'll be like, oh my God, just tear up episode 7. We got so much wrong there.
Redo.
I don't think I'm going to, I don't think I'm going to take that perspective because look, we have what we have in front of us. Right.
Exactly.
So I guess what I'm trying to say, what's really interesting about this idea is that if God is wisdom, and this is how he proves God, and wisdom is something that can occur in the human being, we've got this, we have this theological perspective that doesn't involve what I'm about to step into is like super crazy.
Okay, let's hear it.
What you could be potentially talking about is an aspect of God that is dwelling in us, right? Have you heard the words Jesus yet?
In this text?
Not so far, right? We're not talking about Jesus.
No.
So, if we're not, if Augustine is a Christian, and this is and wisdom hasn't been analogized to Jesus, presumably Jesus has some other function, right? And I think it's going to have something to do more.
I think with justice, probably
going to have more to do with sin.
True.
Okay, and saving us from sin, but what does that leave? What does that leave, right? And if you think about the Trinitarian conception of God, if we're not talking about Jesus being in us because we're wise, and presumably this is something that pagans have access to, which is craziness.
Right.
What other aspects of the Trinity could we be dealing with here?
I'd not take that into consideration. Wow.
I mean, what are the other aspects of the Trinity? You've got God as the Father.
Yeah, and
you got Jesus. It's not Jesus.
Yeah, and then the Holy Spirit.
Could wisdom be the Holy Spirit?
That's a possibility.
I don't know.
It's
It's either the Father or the Holy Spirit. It would seem.
Right. Yeah. Process of elimination.
I don't know. You know what's interesting is that there's a much neglected book, and I have not read it, that I think maybe Augustine anticipated these issues, and he actually wrote a book that I don't know if he finished it or not, but it's called On the Trinity. I've
heard of it. Yeah.
I think he started to I think he realized that a lot of his writing kind of painted him into these conclusive corners, and I think it'd be interesting, maybe in a future lecture series or something like that, maybe I'll go home and do some research or something like that. But he may, and I don't know, I'm very tentatively saying this, he may make the case that the Holy Spirit is wisdom. I don't know.
Right, and this is a perfect example of Augustine reconciling, Greco-Roman philosophy with Christianity.
So, draw that connection.
Well, I don't know. If we take all these sort of Platonic ideals of wisdom, and if we kind of going down this line of saying that wisdom is either God or the Holy Spirit, then it's a meshing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Of beliefs. Whoa, sorry, I'm just what?
Yeah. No, it's pretty huge stuff. It's pretty huge stuff. All right. Well, we're at 40 minutes. I covered everything that I had notes for, but man, I think I think I'm going to have a lot of homework to do.
Yeah, a lot of thinking to do, yep.
between
A lot of
this
mulling
podcast and the next one. Did I leave anything out that you wanted to talk about?
No,
I think I hit all my points.
Yeah, I think pretty much got everything.
Did I do an okay job?
Yeah.
Did I do okay?
I think we did good considering it's Super Tuesday.
Yeah, it is. Okay. All right. See you guys.
Bye, everyone.